Namaskar. Today's guest speaker, Dr. Justine Lemos, is a scholar and dancer who has done considerable work in the history of Mohiniyattam. She is an author, teacher, and founder of Not a Cult and the Bliss Academy, an online wisdom archive, and at One Yoga. She has studied and performed classical Indian dance for 23 years with Guru Ranjana Devi and is an Ayurvedic practitioner, Vedic astrologer, student of Tantric yogas, and a mystical reader of signs, symbols, and omens. She holds a PhD in South Asian cultures from 2003 to 2004. She had a Fulbright grant in India, where she researched the politics of gender as manifest in the subculture of Mohiniyattam. She studied at the prestigious Kerala Kalamandalam and again as a recipient of the American Institute of Indian Studies Dissertation Award Fellowship when she studied the Kalyani Kuti Amma style of Mohiniyattam dance at Nitya Kshetra. She works as an independent scholar, presenting papers, lectures, and performances at conferences and a variety of colleges and universities. She also teaches world dance at Mirza Costa College in addition to owning and directing at One Yoga and Natraj West Performing Arts. I welcome Dr. Justine on behalf of Moham and thank her for sharing her work with us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Justine Lemos, and it's my great privilege and honor to be invited to speak with you today about Mohiniyattam dance. And thank you to Maithili for having organized this video sequence. So my research that was done in Kerala about 10 years ago was embodied research. I actually studied dance at Kalamandalam for almost a year, and then with Sandhya Mohan and Sri Devi in Ernakulam. And then I also did a lot of archival research and interview research where I traveled around Kerala on buses to very remote villages and met with retired journalists, arts maestros, very elderly people who had seen and met with some of the last eldest Mohiniyattam dancers, with dancers even in Trivandrum who were elderly. And so I did a lot of very deep research on the 19th century history of Mohiniyattam and the transition of Mohiniyattam, the period that has been called its decadence, or when it was possibly outlawed, and then its regeneration in its new neoclassical form. So I want to apologize before my talk. At one point I was quite fluent in Malayalam and had a very good knowledge of Sanskrit. It's been a long time since I've used my Malayalam, so deep apologies for any mispronunciations, and the fault is mine. Also, I know many of you are awaiting my book on Mohiniyattam history and embodiment, and my life has gone into such a different direction since I did my research, over 2 years of research, almost 3 years of research in Kerala, that I haven't been able to bring the book to fruition, but I hope to do so this year itself. I'm working on getting a publisher, and a complete draft is, several drafts are completed. So I beg your forgiveness and hope that it will come to fruition soon. Now, in my personal practice, I studied Odissi dance for 23 years with my guru, Ranjana Devi, and it was on her suggestion, because she had studied in Kerala for a long time, that I undertake training and research in Mohiniyattam. So it was with her grace that I came to Kerala, that I just love Kerala and Kerala culture, and was able to do some work on Mohiniyattam history and Mohiniyattam aesthetics, Mohiniyattam embodiment, the embodied practice, and the semiotics of Mohiniyattam, the signs and symbols as embodied praxis. So I thought in this quick talk, I'd talk about some of my findings from the archives, because there's a lot of confusion about Mohiniyattam, its relationship to so-called devadasi practices, if it were outlawed. And I found documents in all of the archives that really help shed light on this. So, was the practice of dedicating women to dance in temple worship a historical institution in Malabar and Cochin and Travancore, what is now Kerala? Um, there's a lot of literature about this, and Narayana's article "Handmaidens of the Gods," and I interviewed Narayana. He argues that literature, temple records, stone inscriptions, and copper plates refer to Nangai and devadasi, who were dedicated to temple service in Trichy and elsewhere in Kerala from as early as the 8th century onward. So he really supports the existence of devadasi, or so-called devadasi. The term is problematic in historical Kerala. He also demonstrates that payments were given to Tevadichikal or Devdasi in Tiruvalla temple. And so he says that they were dancing girls and not menial servants of the temple. And of course, P. Soman's research really rejects the idea that there were so-called Devdasis in Kerala. Now, regardless of the controversies, it's clear from oral and textual history that in the 19th century and into the 20th century, women were dedicated as temple service and practiced dance as part of daily temple rituals and festivals in Travancore and in Kochi. The documents that I located in the Kochi State Archive, the records, and I spent hours and hours in the archives, and I kept looking for records on Mohiniyattam, and I could find nothing with the word Mohiniyattam. And then finally I spoke to a really wonderful archivist there, and I said, I'm looking for anything to do with dance. And he said, oh, here are the records on devadasi. And he handed me a huge stack of files that I went through, and I have copies of all of them, and I make references in my book to each one is footnoted. Okay, so the term that's used in these records is devadasi, and significantly, I found no legal documents. There were no legal documents from the 19th century that mention Mohiniyattam. Nevertheless, the practices of Mohiniyattam dancers during the 1890s, as chronicled in literary documents and in oral histories that I collected, they contain a lot of similarities with practices that conflate broadly with 19th century ethnographic descriptions of devdasi practices. First of all, Mohiniyatakaris, or Mohiniyattam dancers, performed at various temples and households with a dance master. Nair Mohiniyattam dancers underwent the tali tying ritual, the tali ketu kalyanam, that was similar to the marriage of the devadasi to a temple god. Though it is different, they still went through a kind of similar initiation ritual as all Nair women did. Third, like many devdasi, Mohiniyattam dancers were not confined to marriage with a single husband. Fourth, like many so-called devdasi, Nair women followed matrilineal descent. Ethnographic and historical literature on the subject of devdasi throughout India has largely ignored devdasi practices in Cochin and Travancore. There's so much literature on so-called devdasi reform in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, and elsewhere, but really Kerala has been left out. Literature on devdasi outlaw really focuses on Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta presidencies. But actually, there was a project that was aimed at disintegrating devdasi practices and dedications in Travancore and Kochi. Now, I believe that this also affected the practices of rural Mohiniyattam Nair dancers. So there's a few questions that come out here. Is Mohiniyattam in its contemporary avatar, is it an inheritance of Keralite devdasi dance practice? This is a separate question. The question of were there devdasi in Kerala, in Kochi and Travancore in 19th century, we can emphatically say yes. Was that practice linked to Mohiniyattam dance? There are two separate things that were happening. But we can broadly say that the Mohiniyattam dancers Their practices were conflated with all other women's dance practices that went through radical shift, radical reform at this time in history, which was a part and parcel to reforming women's dress, women's marriage practices, and the whole process or the whole practice of femininity within Keralite culture in the 19th century. Okay, so then I found all these laws, okay, and I won't go through them all, but in 1906, devadasis in the Travancore kingdom, they tried to get a raise of salary, and they even struck from work. They had a strike, which and they refused to travel to Trivandrum for Navratri festival. And so it shows that they had an organization or a sense of organization. They had a sense of identity, these dancers did. And then actually they were punished for 3 months and suspended from their duties. And then later that punishment was suspended, and these dancers were given an increase in their salary to compensate for their expenses. So they won their strike. In 1912, Sambadham, or the alliances made by Nair women, was now recognized as legal marriage. You couldn't dissolve it by mutual agreement. That happened in Travancore. So women's marriage was under question, their dress was under question, their practice was under question at this time, with dance really becoming a central aspect. In 1920, Kochi government passes the Nair Regulation Act, so similar to Travancore. And then in 1921, and this has often been depicted in the literature as a outlaw of Mohiniyattam dance, but actually in 1921, under Regent Maharani Setu Lakshmi Bai, her secretary, K. George, he banned further recruitment of Kudikari or Devadasi in Travancore. And then in 1931, he enacted a complete ban on Devadasi system in Travancore. Not on Mohiniyattam, but on dedication of dancers. In 1936, the Cochin Maharaja, he passes Ramavarma Dharmika Chakravarti. He passes the Prevention of Dedication regulation, which prevented women from being dedicated to temples. And then in 1938, Kochi government enacts a ban on all practices of singing and dance, of Devadasi dance at temples in Kochi. So this is this wide ban. But then in 1940, they reinstitute the privileges and say that they're allowed to sing and dance in temple as long as it's on a voluntary basis. So they can no longer get paid for their service to temple. And then in 1940, later in 1940, he prohibits the Diwan of Cochin, prohibits Devadasi dedication, but they're still allowed to receive annulments and perform services. And then in 1941, and this is when there were actually riots in Kochi, Kochi government revokes the right of Devadasi to perform dance in temples as a necessary adjunct of temple worship. They can perform dance voluntarily, but only if it's permitted in temples. In 1942, the voluntary performance of dance by Devadasis in Kochi, in Tirumala temple, leads to public riots and the assault of several Devadasi. And Gangi Lakshmi, who was a Devadasi of Tirumala temple, I have her letter, she directly petitions the Kochi Maharaja for emoluments, for payments due to Devadasi, withheld from temple officials. And then we can also talk about what happened in Travancore, a similar process. And actually, I did an interview with an elder woman who had danced at the courts in the 1930s and 40s, named Indrabai Thankachi. And she began dancing at Travancore court when she was 4 as a palace dancer, but she did training in Bharatanatyam because of the influence from the south. And she stated that there was no practice of Mohiniyattam in Travancore in her youth. So what we have happening is an outlaw of temple dedication and devadasi, so-called devadasi dance in Travancore and in Kochi. And while this is happening, in the stronghold of Mohiniyattam, even before Swati Tiruna period, was the Trishur Palakkad area. And though we can also say the form always had influences from in and outside of Kerala. But what we can deduce is that there was a practice of dedicating Devadasi to perform dance in Travancore temples in 19th and early 20th century and in Kochi temples. So, in addition to linking Mohiniyattam dance to Travancore Devadasi dancers, also authors attempt to link Mohiniyattam dance practices performed in the Kochi temple in the 19th century to Mohiniyattam. Now, it's popularly told that Cochin Maharaja outlawed Mohiniyattam in Kochi in 1930s. It's not really correct. As I read before, he did the Prevention of Dedication Regulation Act extending to the whole Kochi kingdom. So women were no longer allowed to be married to a tree or a dagger to become dedicated to temples. And while it's difficult to link the dances that were performed by women temple dancers in Kochi kingdom to the practices of Nair Mohiniyattam dancers in central Kerala, we need to remember that women's dance is all under question at this time. The dance performed by women in in Kochi was really belonged to the Goan Brahmins, the Konkani Brahmins from Goa. And it's very clear that this is where this dance had its origins and was separate from the Nair Mohiniyattam dancers of central Kerala, Trichur, Palakkad, in the 19th century. So we have these Konkani dancers in Kochi, we have the Travancore dancers in Travancore, and then we have Mohiniyattam dancers in Trishur Palakkad, okay? They are similar in that they're all women's dance practices that have some relationship to temple practices, but they are also all different and separate. I did a fascinating interview with N. Parushottama Malaya, who was born in 1929 and has since passed. And he told me about how he saw the Devadasis of Kochi in his youth. I'll read to you a little bit from this interview because it's very interesting. And then I'll finish up with some thoughts about all of this. So he said, I was in school. With my own eyes, I have seen them dancing. By the time I got to high school, then they stopped. What I had seen was from my school. While the classes were going on, there were holes in the door. We can see through the hole, also through the window. When the palanquin of the deity comes, their dancing is there. Everywhere the palanquin stopped. The I'm not sure, but that's what he said. The song is there. And they go back. And then they will start this way and will go that way. And then again they go. But then they won't go like that. They won't turn around. They won't show their back. They make gestures with their hands and they sway side to side. They used to call the deity. Their songs are all like that. When the temple festival comes, there is a golden Garuda. The Lord is sitting on this Garuda. The Kalavant, the Devadasi lady, will be given respect due to the god. Taking this kutu vilaku, the hanging lamp, she will show a vessel that's called a kumba, the pot, and then pour it in offering to the Lord. Afterwards, the flag will be brought down, and on the throne the Lord will be placed, and the priest will go back. And they will come there, and the elder in the Devadasi community, she will start singing. And in this Kumbha Arti, the offering with the pot, she alone has the right to do the Arti. Except the Devadasi, only the priests have the right to do Artis, no one else. But the Lord will call, where is my Kalavant? Then she will come and she will do the offering, the Arti, and God is pleased. There is another thing. We said Dimli Gori because a lamp. She will keep that on her head and she will dance. Dimli Gori. Dimli means the lamp. And that dance they used to do, everyone will come in for their dance, the special dance they used to keep like that. But you know what happened? People started an agitation because they said the Devadasi are prostitutes, and the community joined together. And the government of Kochi, Raja, brought an order. This should be stopped. So this is what he shared with me. And this discontinuation, I want to finish reading what he said because it's very interesting. When the order came there, these ladies, the Devadasi, protested and they were beaten. But even then, they went on dancing in the temple and they were physically thrown out. They were not allowed to do it, the dance. And they cursed God, beaten. There was a strong protest. The male members of the Devadasi community, they said, okay. But the women members, they protested. They said, it is our culture. We are dedicated to God. It is our way of worship. And the police stood there like that. They were forced to stop dancing. They were beaten, but only by beating it is stopped, not voluntarily. It was stopped by force. Physical force was stopped. So in addition to these anti-Devadasi laws, the Cochin Maharaja also banned so-called lewd theater. And I think that because of perception about Mohiniyattam, especially during the so-called decadence, this would have had an effect on Mohiniyattam. So the controversies regarding existence of Devadasi within historical Kerala and the connection of Mohiniyattam to so-called Devadasi dance practices are probably irresolvable. And Mohiniyattam, it gets really confused with people saying it is and isn't. But, the problem is this term Devadasi. What we can say is that during the time period in question, mid to late 1800s into 1940s, new codes, legal codes in Travancore and Kochi constituted all female dancers, their practices, and their ritual functions as outdated, immoral, and illegal. In the 20th century, as elsewhere in India, women's dance throughout Kerala underwent stigmatization and subsequent reform. And so various dictates and social processes significantly changed in patronage, reconfigured the employment of women. And the stigmatization of Mohiniyattam, its relationship to marriage reform and anti-Devadasi measures were fundamentally intertwined. So this is just a little bit from my research. I hope you've enjoyed. I go very deep, specifically into Indian independence, Mohiniyattam and Desiyattam, into some cartoons that I recovered from Trichur Archive and Library, and the patterns of reconstruction of Mohiniyattam, how it took form in its form as Lasya. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Much love to you. Take care. Let me know if you have any questions.